I found out my daughter-in-law had already listed my house for sale the same morning. She drove me to a nursing home and told me it was just temporary. And I remember sitting there in the passenger seat of her car, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the quiet suburban streets pass by like they belonged to someone else's life, because the house she was planning to sell wasn't just a property. It was where my husband and I had spent 42 years building something real, something steady, something that was never meant to be taken from me while I was still alive. But Claire kept talking in that soft, practiced voice of hers, explaining how this place would be better for me, safer, easier, as if comfort could replace belonging. And Daniel, my son, sat in the back seat scrolling through his phone, not saying a word, not once meeting my eyes in the rearview mirror. And that silence told me more than any explanation ever could, because it wasn't confusion, it wasn't hesitation, it was agreement, quiet and complete. And when we arrived, the building stood tall and clean with wide windows and a polished lobby that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant, the kind of place designed to feel pleasant enough that no one would question why they were being left there. And Claire stepped out first, walking around to open my door with a careful smile, the kind you use when you're managing a situation, not caring for a person, and I let her help me out, even though I didn't need it, because by then I understood something important, something that settled deep and cold inside my chest. This wasn't about my health, and it certainly wasn't about my comfort. This was about my house, and the way she had asked about my paperwork 2 days earlier, the way she had lingered in my study, flipping through documents she had no reason to touch, the way she had mentioned rising property values like she was commenting on the weather, all of it came back to me in quiet, precise pieces, fitting together into a picture that no longer left room for doubt. And still, I said nothing. I didn't question her. I didn't confront Daniel. I simply followed them inside, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant murmur of televisions. From behind closed doors, the slow shuffle of footsteps from residents who had already been placed where I was now being placed. And when the receptionist handed me a clipboard, Claire reached for it before I could, smiling again as she said, "Don't worry, Margaret, I'll handle all of this." And I nodded, as if I were grateful, as if I were relieved, as if I didn't already know that somewhere, at that exact moment, my name was being replaced on a listing, my home reduced to square footage and market value. And I let her believe it. I let her believe I didn't understand, because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is show your hand too early. And as I signed the last form they placed in front of me, I made a quiet decision. I would not fight this here, not in this lobby, not in front of strangers. I would wait, I would watch, and I would make sure that when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just stop her. It would undo everything she thought she had already won. I woke up the next morning to the quiet hum of the hallway outside my room, a sound that felt unfamiliar, too steady, too controlled, and for a moment I stayed still in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling tiles arranged in perfect squares, trying to remember the creak of my own wooden floors at home, the way the morning light used to spill through the kitchen window and land across the table where I drank my coffee every day for more than 4 decades. But here the light was different, filtered through blinds that did not belong to me, touching furniture that held no memory, and I sat up slowly, folding the blanket back with careful hands, not because I needed to be careful, but because routine was the only thing that still felt like mine. And on the small table beside the bed sat my purse, placed there by Claire the night before, positioned just neatly enough to feel intentional, and I reached for it, opening it to check what was inside, my wallet, my glasses case, a small photograph of my husband tucked into the inner pocket, but something was missing. The envelope where I kept copies of my property documents was gone, and I closed the purse without reacting, setting it back exactly where it had been, as if nothing had changed. Because by then I understood that reacting would only confirm what they expected of me, confusion, fear, dependence, and I would not give them that. Instead I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the parking lot below, cars coming and going, visitors arriving with flowers or leaving with polite smiles. And I wondered how many of the people in those rooms upstairs had arrived the same way I had, gently guided into a place they never truly chose, and how many of them had realized too late what was being taken from them. And a soft knock came at the door before it opened, a nurse stepping in with a clipboard and a practiced kindness in her voice, asking how I had slept, if I needed anything. if I was settling in comfortably, and I answered politely, thanking her, keeping my voice even, my expression calm. Because there was no reason for her to see anything else. She was not part of this. She was just doing her job. And after she left, I sat in the chair by the window and began to think, not about what had already happened, but about what it meant, about the sequence of small moments that had led here, the questions Claire had asked about my finances, the way she had insisted on helping organize my paperwork, the way Daniel had started deferring to her on decisions that once would have involved me, each detail now sharper than before, each one pointing in the same direction, and I reached for the phone on the table, dialing a number I had not used in months, listening as it rang twice before a familiar voice answered, steady, attentive, and I said her name quietly. Evelyn, it is Margaret. And there was a pause on the other end, not of confusion, but of recognition, as if she had been expecting this call long before I had decided to make it. And I did not explain everything. Not yet. I only asked one question, simple and precise. Can you check if my house has been listed? And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with confirmation before she even spoke, and when she finally did, her voice had changed, no longer casual, no longer distant, but focused, careful. As she told me she would look into it immediately, and I thanked her, ending the call with the same calm tone I had used all morning, setting the phone back in its place, folding my hands in my lap, and waiting, because for the first time since I stepped into this building, I was no longer just observing what had been done to me. I was beginning to see exactly how it had been done, and more importantly, how it could be undone. The call with Evelyn lasted less than 3 minutes, but it changed the shape of everything, and I sat there afterward with my hands resting lightly on the armrests, feeling the quiet settle around me again. The same quiet as before, but no longer empty. Now it carried weight, direction, and I watched the second hand of the small clock on the wall move in steady ticks, each one marking time that no longer belonged to Claire, and less than an hour later my phone rang. The same number, the same steady voice on the other end. But this time there was no pause, no softness, only clarity, and she said my house had been listed 2 days ago, full market listing, professional photos, scheduled showings beginning at the end of the week, and for a moment I closed my eyes, not in shock, not in disbelief, but in recognition, because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This had not been a sudden decision. It had been planned, structured, executed with the kind of quiet precision that only looks effortless from the outside. And I asked one question, simple and exact, whose name is on the listing? And when she answered, she did not rush, she did not soften it. She said Claire Whitmore, acting under assumed authorization, and Daniel Whitmore listed as secondary contact, and I let that settle without interruption, because hearing it out loud mattered. It placed everything in its proper position, not suspicion, not misunderstanding, but intention. And Evelyn continued, explaining that the documents attached included a digital authorization form, one that appeared to carry my name, my consent, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was expected. The missing envelope, the questions about paperwork, the careful way Claire had positioned herself as helpful, all of it led here, and I thanked Evelyn, my voice steady, asking her to obtain copies of everything, every document, every timestamp, every signature, and she agreed without hesitation, her tone shifting into something more deliberate, more aligned with the way she used to speak when we worked together years ago, when details mattered and timing was everything. And after the call ended, I remained where I was, looking out the window again, watching a delivery truck pull into the lot, a man stepping out with a clipboard, moving with purpose, unaware of the quiet calculations taking place above him. And I thought about Daniel, about the way he had avoided my eyes, about the years I had spent believing that distance was just a part of growing older, that space between a mother and her adult son was natural, inevitable. But this was not distance, this was absence, and absence has a different weight when it is chosen. And I did not feel anger the way I once might have. I did not feel the sharp edge of betrayal. Instead, I felt something colder, something clearer, the kind of understanding that does not rush, that does not shout, but settles in place and refuses to move. And I stood then, walking slowly back to the bed, straightening the pillow, smoothing the blanket, small movements that required no thought, allowing my mind to work elsewhere, mapping out what came next, because the listing was only the surface. Beneath it were actions that could be traced, signatures that could be challenged, timelines that could be exposed, and Claire believed she had already secured the outcome. She believed placing me here removed me from the equation. But she had misunderstood something fundamental. I had not been removed. I had simply been relocated. And there is a difference she would soon learn. And as the afternoon light shifted slightly across the floor, I reached for my purse again, this time not to check what was missing, but to confirm what remained, my identification, my access, my ability to act. And I placed it back exactly where it belonged, because everything now depended on precision, on patience, on allowing her to continue just long enough to make the mistake she believed she had already avoided. That afternoon, after the call ended, I allowed myself to sit with the truth in a different way, not as a problem to solve, but as a pattern to understand, because nothing Claire had done existed on its own. Every action had a beginning, and if I traced it back far enough, I could see where it had first taken shape, and I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes briefly, not to rest, but to remember the small changes that had once felt harmless, almost considerate, the way she had started offering to organize my mail, stacking envelopes into neat piles, suggesting that I should not have to deal with so much paperwork at my age, and I had let her, because it sounded like kindness, because I had no reason then to question it. And then there were the afternoons she spent in my study, saying she was looking for old family photos, asking where I kept important documents, where the property records were stored, and I had answered without hesitation, pointing to the cabinet, even laughing once when she said I should consider digitizing everything, that it would be so much easier, and I see now how. Carefully she built that access, not forcing anything, not rushing, just placing herself closer and closer to the things that mattered, until it no longer seemed unusual for her to be there at all, and Daniel had followed her lead in quiet ways, deferring to her when decisions came up, asking her opinion before mine, using phrases that sounded practical but felt distant. And I had told myself that was just how marriages worked, that priorities shifted, that I needed to give them space, and I did. I stepped back where I once would have stepped forward, and in that space, something else grew, something I chose not to name at the time, and now, sitting in a room that held none of my history, I could see it clearly, not as a series of moments, but as a single line moving steadily toward this outcome, and the thought did not upset me the way it might have before. It clarified things. It removed the last traces of doubt. Because there is a difference between being surprised and being unprepared, and I was no longer either of those things. And when a staff member knocked again to ask if I wanted to join the group activity in the common room, I declined politely, offering a small smile, because I had no interest in distractions, not when every detail now mattered. And instead I remained where I was, reviewing the sequence in my mind with the same care I once used when balancing accounts, checking each step, each assumption, and I realized something else, something that settled just as firmly as the rest. Claire had relied on my silence for years. She had grown comfortable in it, interpreting it as weakness, as compliance, as permission, and that misunderstanding was now the only advantage I needed. Because she would not expect resistance from me, not real resistance, not the kind that moves quietly and waits for the exact moment to be seen. And I stood then, walking slowly to the dresser, opening the drawer where I had placed the few belongings they allowed me to bring, running my fingers lightly over the fabric of my sweater, the edges of a folded scarf, grounding myself in something familiar, something still mine. And I thought of my husband, of the way he used to handle difficult situations, never rushing, never reacting in front of others, always waiting until he had every piece in place before making a move. And I realized I had learned more from him than I ever gave myself credit for, because this was not a moment for confrontation. It was a moment for precision. And as I closed the drawer and returned to the chair by the window, the light now softer, stretching longer across the floor, I understood that what Claire had started, she believed was already finished, but, in truth, it had only just begun, and this time, I would be the one deciding how it ended. The next morning, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I allowed someone into the truth of my situation, not as a complaint, not as a plea, but as a calculated step. And when Evelyn arrived just after 10, she did not bring flowers or polite conversation. She brought a folder, thick, organized, and she closed the door behind her with a quiet precision that matched the way she used to handle serious matters. And for a moment we simply looked at each other, not as old friends catching up, but as two people who understood exactly what kind of conversation this was going to be. And she sat across from me, placing the folder on the small table between us, opening it carefully, revealing printed listings, screenshots, timestamps, and copies of documents that should never have existed without my direct involvement. And she slid the first page toward me without a word, and I recognized my house immediately. The front porch I had painted 3 summers ago, the garden I had planted with my own hands, now presented in clean, polished images designed to attract buyers who would never know what that house meant. And beneath the photos were the details, square footage, estimated value, open house schedule, all of it laid out in a way that reduced a lifetime into numbers and dates. And I read it without reacting, because reacting would not change anything. Understanding would. And Evelyn began to explain, her voice steady, measured, pointing out the inconsistencies, the authorization form that carried my name but not my signature, the timestamps that showed it had been submitted from a device not registered to me, the listing agreement signed digitally less than 24 hours before I was brought here, and each detail added weight, not to my emotions, but to the structure of what had been done, because this was no longer about suspicion, it was about evidence. And I asked her one question, simple and direct, can this be stopped? And she did not answer immediately. She closed the folder slightly, considering, and then she said yes, but timing matters. And I understood exactly what she meant, because stopping it too early would only allow Claire to adjust, to retreat, to cover what she had done, but allowing it to continue just a little longer would give us something stronger, something undeniable. And I nodded, because that aligned with what I had already begun to see. And Evelyn leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that suggested she was measuring something, not my understanding, but my resolve. And I met her gaze without hesitation, because there was nothing uncertain left in me now, and she gave a small nod in return, as if confirming what she needed to know, and she began outlining the next steps, documenting everything, preserving records, allowing the process to move forward just enough to reach a point where it could not be denied. And I listened carefully, not interrupting, not rushing, because every word mattered. And when she finished, there was a brief silence, the kind that does not feel empty, but complete. And I placed my hand lightly on the folder, not to claim it, but to acknowledge it. And I said we will let her continue. And Evelyn did not question it. She simply closed the folder again, her expression calm, almost approving. And as she stood to leave, she paused for a moment at the door, looking back at me with something that was not quite concern and not quite admiration, but something close to both. And then she left, and the room returned to its quiet. The same quiet as before, but now it held something different, something firm, something decided. And I sat there for a long moment, looking at the place where the folder had been, understanding that everything had shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that would soon make itself known, because Claire believed she was nearing the end of her plan, and in a way, she was, just not in the way she expected. That evening, I followed the routine they had quietly designed for me. I attended dinner in the common dining room, sat at a table with 2 other residents who spoke in polite, distant tones, and I listened more than I spoke, nodding at the right moments, allowing myself to appear exactly as they expected, a woman adjusting to a new environment, slightly withdrawn, slightly uncertain. And when the staff asked if everything was comfortable, I answered yes, always yes, because comfort was not the point. And as I returned to my room afterward, I noticed how easily the role fit, how natural it seemed to everyone around me. No one questioned why I was there. No one asked what had led me to this place. And that was the part Claire had counted on, that once I was inside this system, I would simply become part of it, another quiet presence behind a numbered door. But she had underestimated something fundamental. She had assumed that silence meant surrender, and that assumption was now working in my favor, because the less I resisted, the less anyone looked closely. And later that night, as I sat by the window with the lights dimmed, my phone resting in my hand, I received a message from Evelyn, short, precise, confirming that the first showing of my house was scheduled for Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. And I read the message twice, not because I needed to, but because the timing mattered, Everything now revolved around that moment. And I replied with a single word, understood, before setting the phone down and letting the quiet return, and I began to map out the next steps with careful clarity, not rushing ahead, not allowing emotion to interfere, because every move needed to align. And the next morning, Claire called, her voice bright, controlled, asking how I was settling in, if the staff was treating me well, if I needed anything from the house, and I answered in the same calm tone I had used with everyone else, telling her everything was fine, that I was getting used to the routine, that it was quieter than I expected, and she seemed pleased with that. I could hear it in the slight shift of her voice, the way she relaxed just enough to reveal satisfaction, and then she mentioned, almost casually, that she might stop by the house later to pick up a few things, and I acknowledged it without question, because questioning would only alert her, and after the call ended, I remained still for a moment, holding the phone in my hand, considering how easily she moved between concern and control, how naturally she blended them together, and I placed the phone down carefully, because what mattered now was not what she said, but what she believed, and she believed I was exactly where she wanted me, removed, quiet, no longer part of the decisions being made, and that belief would allow her to continue, to move forward without hesitation, without caution, and that was precisely what I needed, because the closer she came to finalizing the sale, the more visible everything would become, and as the day unfolded, I maintained the same pattern, polite conversations, quiet observation, small movements that revealed nothing, and inside, everything remained steady, focused, aligned with a single point in time, Saturday morning, 10 o'clock, when what she thought was the conclusion of her plan would begin to unravel in a way she had not prepared for. And as the evening light faded once again across the floor, I understood that waiting was no longer passive. It was deliberate, it was controlled, and it was leading exactly where it needed to go. Saturday morning arrived without announcement, no sense of urgency. In the hallway, no shift in the routine that anyone else could notice. But for me, every second carried weight, and I woke before the light had fully settled across the room, sitting at the edge of the bed with my hands resting lightly on my knees, not thinking about what might happen, but about what would, because by now there was no uncertainty left, only timing, and I dressed slowly, choosing the same neutral sweater I had worn 2 days before. Nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would suggest anything had changed, because to everyone here, nothing had, and when I stepped into the hallway, the same quiet greeted me, the same soft footsteps, the same distant voices, and I moved through it all with measured calm, acknowledging the staff, offering small smiles, becoming exactly what I had been since I arrived, predictable, unremarkable, and after breakfast, I returned to my room and sat by the window, my phone placed beside me, waiting, not for a signal, but for the right moment, and at 9:45, it came, a message from Evelyn, short, precise, "They are there," and I read it once, then set the phone down without responding, because there was no need for words now. Everything had already been arranged, and I stood, smoothing the front of my sweater, taking a single breath that felt neither deep nor shallow, just steady, and I walked to the door, pausing only long enough to ensure that everything about me remained exactly as it should appear, calm, composed, unchanged, and when I stepped into the hallway again, nothing about the building had shifted, but I had, and I made my way to the front desk, informing the receptionist that I had a scheduled outing, my voice even, my expression polite, and she nodded without question, checking the clipboard, confirming my name, because from her perspective, this was routine, another resident leaving briefly, nothing more, and I signed where she indicated, the pen moving smoothly across the paper, my name, written clearly, intentionally, and I placed the pen back exactly where it belonged, because details matter, even the smallest ones, and outside. The air was cooler than I expected, carrying the faint scent of early fall, and Evelyn's car was waiting near the curb, engine running, her posture straight, her expression focused as I approached, and she did not greet me with conversation. She simply unlocked the door, and I got in, closing it quietly behind me. And as the car pulled away from the building, I did not look back, because there was nothing there that belonged to me, not anymore, and the drive was silent, not uncomfortable, but purposeful, the kind of silence that exists when both people understand what is about to happen, and as we turned onto my street, the familiar line of houses came into view, the trees I had watched grow taller over the years, the sidewalk I had walked so many times, and then my house appeared at the end of the block, exactly as it always had been. Except now there were cars parked along the curb, a sign in the front yard, clean and professional, announcing something that had never been mine to announce, and I watched it all without reacting, because this was not the moment for emotion, this was the moment for presence. And Evelyn slowed the car as we approached, pulling to a stop just beyond the driveway. And for a brief second, everything held still, the engine idling, the morning quiet, the open front door where strangers now moved through rooms that had once held my life. And I reached for the door handle, not hesitating, not questioning, because this was the point where waiting ended and action began. And as I stepped out onto the pavement, closing the door behind me with quiet precision, I knew that whatever Claire believed was happening inside that house, she had not planned for this. The front door was open, just as I had seen from the street, and voices drifted out into the crisp morning air, light, conversational, the kind of voices people use when they are imagining a future that does not belong to them yet. And I walked up the path without hesitation, my steps even, my posture straight, not rushing, not slowing, because this was still my home, regardless of what had been arranged inside it. And as I crossed the threshold, the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh paint met me, layered now with something artificial, staged, the faint trace of candles that were never mine, furniture adjusted just enough to look appealing, photographs repositioned to feel neutral, and I paused for a brief moment in the entryway, not out of uncertainty, but to take in the space as it had been presented to strangers. And then I stepped forward, and the first person who noticed me was not Claire. It was a couple standing near the staircase, their conversation faltering as they turned toward me, their expressions shifting from curiosity to confusion, because I did not fit into the picture they had been given, and I met their gaze with calm acknowledgement, offering a small nod as I moved past them, because this was not about them. And further inside, near the living room, the real estate agent stood speaking to another group, her tone practiced, confident, describing features and possibilities, and when her eyes landed on me, there was a brief flicker of uncertainty, a break in her rhythm that lasted only a second before she attempted to recover, asking if I needed assistance. And I answered simply, "No, thank you," my voice steady, my presence deliberate, and I continued walking until I saw Claire, standing near the kitchen island, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, speaking to a potential buyer with the same controlled warmth she had used with me days before. And for a moment I observed her, the ease with which she moved through the space, the confidence that came from believing everything was already secured. And then she turned, her eyes meeting mine, and in that instant, everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The color in her face changing just enough to reveal recognition, and something beneath it, something she had not prepared for, and the room seemed to hold its breath, conversations lowering, attention narrowing, because the presence of something unexpected alters a space in ways people cannot always explain. And I did not raise my voice. I did not rush toward her. I simply walked forward at the same measured pace, stopping a few feet away, allowing the distance to remain. Because distance can be more powerful than proximity when used correctly. And she opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came immediately. And in that silence, I understood that the moment had arrived, not the end, but the turning point, and I reached into my purse, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same calm precision I had carried with me since the beginning, and I took out a single document, holding it lightly in my hand, not presenting it yet, just letting it exist between us, a quiet reminder that this was no longer a private matter. And as the agent stepped closer, sensing something was wrong, asking if everything was all right, I turned slightly, meeting her gaze with the same composed expression, and said, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding the ownership of this property." And the words settled into the room with a clarity that could not be ignored, and Claire's composure faltered, not completely, not enough for anyone else to fully understand yet, but enough for me to see that the certainty she had carried was no longer intact. And I stood there, steady, patient, knowing that everything that followed would unfold exactly as it needed to, because for the first time since this began, I was no longer waiting. The room did not erupt into chaos. It did something quieter, something more revealing. It shifted. Conversations lowered into whispers. People stepped back just slightly, creating space around something they did not yet understand but instinctively knew mattered. And I remained exactly where I was, holding the document without raising it, without forcing attention, because attention had already found me. And the agent glanced between Claire and me, her expression tightening with professional concern, asking again if everything was all right. And this time Claire answered, her voice controlled but thinner than before, saying there must be some confusion, that I was her mother-in-law, that everything had been handled properly. And I listened without interrupting, allowing her to speak, allowing her to build the explanation she believed would restore order, because interruption would only make it seem like a disagreement. And this was not a disagreement. It was a correction. And when she finished, I took a single step forward, not closing the distance entirely, just enough to place myself clearly within the center of the room, and I held out the document, not to her, but to the agent, who hesitated for only a moment before accepting it, her fingers careful, her eyes scanning the page as the silence deepened around us. And I watched her expression change, not dramatically, but in stages: recognition, concern, and then something more definitive. And she looked up at me, then at Claire, and asked a question that carried more weight than her tone suggested, asking if there was legal authorization for the listing beyond what had been submitted. And Claire responded quickly, too quickly, referencing documents, agreements, explanations that sounded practiced but now lacked the confidence they once held. And I spoke then, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that did not require volume, saying that any authorization bearing my name had been created without my consent, that I had not signed any agreement to sell my property, and that the matter was now under formal review. And the words settled into the room with precision, leaving no space for interpretation. And the couple near the staircase exchanged a glance, stepping further back, their interest replaced by caution. And the agent straightened slightly, her role shifting from presentation to responsibility. And she asked for a moment, stepping aside to make a call, her voice lowered but urgent. And Claire turned to me then, her composure no longer steady, her eyes searching my face as if looking for something she could still control. And she said my name in a tone that attempted familiarity, attempting to pull this back into something private, something manageable. But I did not respond in the way she expected. I did not soften. I did not lower my voice. I simply met her gaze with the same calm I had carried from the beginning, because this was no longer a conversation between family members. This was the result of actions she had chosen to take. And behind her, I could see Daniel standing near the doorway to the kitchen, his posture uncertain, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and realization. And for a brief moment, our eyes met. And in that moment, I saw something shift in him, not fully, not completely, but enough to suggest that the version of events he had accepted was no longer holding. And I looked away first, not out of avoidance, but because my focus remained exactly where it needed to be, on the structure of what was unfolding, not the emotions attached to it. And when the agent returned, her demeanor had changed, more formal, more cautious, and she informed the room that the showing would need to be paused due to a discrepancy in the listing authorization. Her words measured, professional, but final, and the effect was immediate. Conversations ceased. People began to move toward the exit, not hurried, but decisive, because uncertainty removes comfort faster than any explanation can restore it. And I stepped back slightly then, allowing the space to clear, not claiming victory, not reacting at all, because this was only one step, an important one, but not the last. And as the front door opened and closed in steady intervals, the house returning slowly to a quieter state, I remained where I was, knowing that everything Claire had built on assumption was now beginning to come apart, piece by piece, in full view, exactly as it needed to. When the last of the visitors stepped out and the door closed behind them, the house did not feel empty. It felt exposed, as if everything that had been carefully arranged was now standing without support. And the silence that followed was not peaceful, it was precise. And I remained where I was, allowing that silence to settle fully before I moved. Because moments like this do not need to be rushed, they need to be understood. And the agent stood near the front of the room, speaking quietly into her phone again, her tone controlled but firm. While Claire remained near the kitchen, her posture no longer relaxed, her hands resting against the counter as if she needed something solid to hold on to. And Daniel had not moved from where I had seen him before, his presence now uncertain, as if he had stepped into something he did not recognize. And I took a few slow steps forward, not toward Claire, but into the space itself, reclaiming it without announcement, without declaration, simply by being present in it as I always had been. And Claire finally spoke again, her voice lower now, no longer directed at an audience, but at me, asking what I was doing, why I was here, as if the answer should have been obvious to her. And I met her question with the same calm I had carried from the beginning, saying that I was where I had always belonged, and she attempted to respond, to shift the situation back into something she could manage, referencing misunderstandings, paperwork, timing, but the words no longer carried the same structure. They no longer held together, because the foundation they depended on had already been removed. And Daniel stepped forward then, not confidently, not decisively, but enough to show that he could no longer remain still, and he asked Claire what was going on, his voice uncertain, searching for clarity in a situation that had already begun to provide it. And Claire turned to him quickly, her explanation immediate, layered with details that once might have sounded reasonable, but now felt incomplete. And I did not interrupt them. I allowed that exchange to unfold, because it was necessary, not for me, but for him. And as he listened, I watched the shift in his expression, the gradual recognition that what he had accepted without question no longer aligned with what he was seeing. And when he looked at me again, there was something different in his gaze, not resolution, not yet, but awareness, and that was enough. And the agent returned from her call, her posture now fully professional, informing us that the listing would be formally suspended pending verification of ownership and authorization, her words clear, leaving no room for interpretation. And Claire's reaction was immediate, controlled but strained, questioning the need for such action, suggesting that everything could be clarified quickly, but the agent did not engage with that. She simply repeated that the process required documentation, and that until it was provided, no further showings would take place. And I listened without reacting, because this was not the moment for satisfaction, it was the moment for completion. And I reached into my purse once more, removing another document, this one more detailed, placing it gently on the table near the entrance, not handing it to anyone directly, but making it available. And I stated, with the same steady tone, that all original property records were in my possession and had been verified, and that any document suggesting otherwise would need to be examined carefully. And the words did not need emphasis, they carried their own weight, and the room held that weight without resistance. And Claire's composure shifted again, more visibly now, the certainty she had relied on no longer present, replaced by something less stable. And Daniel stepped back slightly, creating distance between them, not dramatically, but enough to signal that something had changed. And I did not move toward either of them. I remained where I was, centered, still, because everything that needed to happen was already in motion. And as the agent began to gather her materials, preparing to leave, I took one final look around the space, not as it had been staged, but as it truly was. And I understood that this was not about reclaiming control, it was about restoring truth, and that process had already begun, quietly, precisely, exactly as it needed to. After the agent left and the door closed for the final time, the house settled into a silence that felt different from before, not uncertain, not tense, but resolved. And I stood there for a moment longer, allowing that shift to fully take hold. Because moments like this mark a boundary, not just in events, but in understanding. And Claire moved first, stepping away from the kitchen counter, her posture no longer controlled, her voice sharper now as she asked how I had done this, how I had known, how I had interfered. And I listened without reacting, because her questions were not requests for answers, they were attempts to regain footing. And Daniel remained near the doorway, his presence quieter now, his attention no longer divided. And I turned slightly toward Claire, meeting her gaze with the same steady calm. And I said that nothing had been interfered with, only revealed, and that difference mattered. And she began to respond again, faster this time, referencing intentions, explaining that everything had been for my benefit, that the house was too much for me, that this arrangement had been practical, necessary, but the words did not carry the same weight they once might have, because intent does not erase action. And I let her finish, because finishing mattered. It allowed the full shape of what she believed to be seen clearly. And when she stopped, I did not argue. I did not correct every detail. I simply said that decisions about my home had never been hers to make, and the simplicity of that statement held more force than anything louder could have. And Daniel spoke then, his voice lower, asking if what I had said about the authorization was true, and Claire turned to him quickly, attempting to answer. But he did not look at her. He looked at me, and I met his gaze. Without hesitation, confirming it with a single nod, because truth does not require elaboration when it is clear, and something in his expression shifted again, more definitively this time, the uncertainty giving way to recognition, and he stepped back once more, not toward her, but away, creating space that had not existed before, and Claire noticed it. Of course she did. And that realization altered her posture in a way no words could, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not have a response ready, and the room held that absence quietly, allowing it to settle, and I reached for my purse, not as a gesture of leaving, but as a natural movement, because what needed to be said had already been said, and I walked slowly toward the front of the house, not looking back immediately, because this was not about turning away, it was about moving forward. And when I reached the doorway, I paused, not out of hesitation, but to acknowledge the space once more, not as it had been staged, not as it had been used, but as it truly was, mine, and I stepped outside into the open air, the quiet of the street unchanged, the sign still standing in the yard, now carrying a different meaning than it had an hour before, and Evelyn was waiting in the car, her expression calm as she watched me approach, and I got in without a word, closing the door softly, and as we pulled away, I glanced once through the window at the house, not with longing, not with relief, but with clarity, because what had been taken had not been lost, it had been tested, and what had been revealed could not be undone, and as the house disappeared behind us, I understood that what remained was not the end of something, but the beginning of something that would no longer be shaped by anyone else's assumptions. When we arrived back at the house later that afternoon, the sign in the yard was already gone, removed quietly, as if it had never been there at all, and I stepped out of the car slowly, taking in the familiar shape of the front porch, the way the sunlight settled across the railing, the same way it had for years, unchanged by everything that had happened in between, and I walked up the path with a steadiness that did not come from certainty, but from completion, because there is a difference between returning to something and reclaiming it, and this was not a return. This was a restoration, and when I opened the front door, the air inside felt different again, no longer staged, no longer arranged for someone else's future, but quiet in a way that felt honest, and I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, the sound soft but final, and for a moment I stood there in the entryway, not moving, allowing myself to feel the space without interruption, the weight of memory still present in every corner, the subtle imperfections that had once been smoothed over now visible again, and I walked into the living room, running my fingers lightly along the edge of the bookshelf, the same place where my husband used to leave his reading glasses, the same place where I had dusted every week without thinking about it, and I did not feel overwhelmed. I did not feel emotional in the way people expect. Instead, I felt something quieter, something deeper, a sense that what had been tested had held, and that mattered more than anything that had been said or done. And later that evening, Evelyn sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I had spent so many mornings before. All of this began, and we reviewed the final steps, the legal confirmations, the corrections that had already been filed, the protections now in place to ensure that no one could attempt something like this again. And I listened carefully, asking only what needed to be asked, because this was not about undoing what had happened. It was about ensuring that it could not be repeated, and when she finished, she closed the folder with a small, definitive motion, and she looked at me for a moment. Not as a lawyer, not as someone handling a case, but as someone who understood what it takes to stand still when everything around you is shifting, and she said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and after she left, the house returned to its quiet once more, the kind of quiet that does not press in, but settles around you. And I moved through the room slowly, not checking, not searching, just acknowledging the kitchen, the hallway, the bedroom, each space exactly where it had always been, unchanged in the ways that mattered. And when I reached the bedroom, I paused at the doorway, looking at the bed, the window, the small details that had carried so much of my life without ever asking for recognition, and I stepped inside, placing my purse on the dresser, setting it down in the same spot it had rested for years. And that simple action felt more complete than anything else, because it meant I was no longer being placed somewhere. I was choosing where I stood, and as the evening light faded, I sat by the window, looking out at the street, watching as the day came to its natural close, and I thought about everything that had led here, not with regret, not with anger, but with clarity, because understanding does not always come when things are easy. It comes when they are tested, and what I understood now was simple. They believed they were removing me from my own life. They believed they could decide what I was capable of, what I deserved, what I would accept, but they had mistaken silence for weakness and patience for surrender, and I let that misunderstanding remain until the moment it no longer served them. And as I sat there in the quiet of my own home, I realized that nothing had been taken from me that I could not reclaim, and nothing they had built on assumption could stand once truth was allowed to speak. And I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to prove anything further, because everything that mattered was already in place. And as the last light disappeared beyond the trees, I rested my hands in my lap, steady, certain, and I understood something that did not need to be said out loud. They thought they were taking my home, but they forgot something far more important. I was the one who built it.